Hey, welcome to MicroChurch Next. I'm Rob Wegner. Brian Johnson. He's going to introduce our guest in just a second. And we just want to say we're glad you're here. We want to create a table, a space for anyone who's pursuing simple, hyperlocal, deeply rooted, mission centered, smaller expressions of the church that have come to be known as MicroChurch. We see them as extended spiritual families. They're led by ordinary people. They're seeking to live in everyday gospel community, and they're owning the mission of Jesus in a specific network of relationships. And this conversation is continuing to gain more and more traction with the next generation of leaders. We think it's one of the most hopeful things that's actually happening underneath the surface in our country right now. And this space on Tuesdays, we want it to be a fire where we can come together. And like we always say, we want to remind you, you're not crazy and you're not alone. So we're on a journey right now exploring the origin stories of a number of different microchurch networks. What's great about where we're at right now, and I love it, is there is no website you can go to and find microchurch networks. There's no like master list. It's still very organic and relational, and there's something really beautiful about it. But maybe one of the most influential networks in the West has been the Tampa Underground. And today we get the honor of hearing that origin story. Brian, what do you want to add to that?
I just want to highlight what you said. There is no master list. There's no place you can go to. And the very fact that you're recording in your garage should tell you a little bit about the underground nature of who we are. So, man, we're on our shoestring budgets doing our thing, trying to make a difference in our cities. We know the church across the world is doing that. But there is something, right, like you said, special about just these new experiments and the way people are reimagining the priesthood of all believers, bringing everyday people into their mission. So looking forward to this conversation because Tampa has had such an impact on the Kansas City Underground. I mean, we begged them to use their name, and they relented because we'd already bought the website. And today we get to hang out with Tomy. The first time I went to Tampa, actually, I stayed in your house. You guys put my wife, Kristen, and me up and just got to spend some time with you and Brian. So just looking forward to hearing more of the story today. So let's just go into that. Tomy, if you want to tell us just a little bit about who you are, your family, and then we'll get more into the story of the network itself.
Yeah, so I am Tomy, like you said, born and raised in roughly San Francisco Bay Area, California. I moved to Tampa as a university student, as a college student, and went to the University of Tampa. I was not a Christian at the time, and it really wasn't on my list of things to do. Like Jesus wasn't on the priority list. It was kind of get in, have as much fun as I can because I'm away from home for the first time, and get out and go on to the next thing. And but still there was some spiritual openness there. And so when I got invited to a Bible study through InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, I said, sure, why not? I'll give it a shot. I'll check it out. And they were the strangest group of Christians I had ever met in my whole life. Like, for the first time, I met Christians who admitted that they didn't have all the answers, that they weren't judging me upon entry, and they were trying to figure out this whole life Jesus thing. And there was something about it that was extremely loving and welcoming that really opened the door for me to look at Jesus for the first time, even though I'd gone. So this is like the crazy thing is I went to Christian schools for a good chunk of my early education. But it felt like in college, I really saw Jesus for the first time and was just so enamored by who this person was that I just said, okay, whatever this person is or has for me, I want it. I'm all in. And so that changed everything. Went on staff at InterVarsity for a number of years, met my wife through InterVarsity. We spent a considerable chunk of time in the Cayman Islands where she's from, and I was doing student ministry out there. And then we moved back in 2018 to work for the Underground. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been a crazy adventure since then. I've had many job titles since starting to work for the Underground. And so it probably, even by the time that this whole thing airs or people hear it or whatever, who's to say that my job title will even be the same? I just work for the underground, and I'm happy to play my part in the story of God. And so that's me. Brian, when you would have come, you would have lived in our termite infested rented house. But it was good to have you and to meet your wife, man.
Yeah, I don't recall the termite infested part, but I do remember feeling a deep sense of connectedness, and just the hospitality that you show to us was, I don't know, it felt like we were immediately in the family. So loved getting to know both of you, and just the continued relationship between these two networks and what Jesus is doing in this bigger family that we call the underground.
Yeah, we are learning from you, even as you all maybe have learned from us. And so it's been cool to feed off of each other in that way.
Thanks for that. Hey, I had a question, something that popped up as you were sharing your story. I thought it was interesting that you attended Christian schools, and yet really had your awakening to the person of Jesus in college. Could you unpack that a little bit more? What landed you in Christian schools, and what was the image of Jesus that you were carrying with you when you got to Tampa?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, Christian schools, your parents put me there. They put their kids in Christian schools, not always because they believe, but because education, right? Like you're afraid of the dangers of public education, or you hear horror stories about the quality of education in public schools. Mm-hmm. And so put them in Christian schools where they'll, get a good education, they'll have some good morals, and that'll be that. Mm-hmm. And so I'm pretty sure that was maybe a little bit of the intention. And I think to a certain extent, my parents did grow up with some spiritual religious background. But yeah, I mean, their own commitment to the church, their own commitment to Jesus, I think was something that they themselves are figuring out. And so because of that, I mean, Jesus just becomes homework, right? Like you memorize your Bible verses, you do well on the tests, and you might know some facts, but not because you actually believe it, or because you love Jesus, or because you've had some meaningful experience necessarily, but because you're a good student, or because your grades depend on it or something. And so I don't know what would have been the image of Jesus that I would have had, maybe as much as I would have known just from little experiences in youth groups or Christian experiences that I was a part of, that, sometimes there was, of course, all the judgment and hypocrisy, and it just felt like this impossible standard to live into. Like there was a way that they wanted you to live your life, but it felt like they themselves couldn't necessarily do it. And yet it felt like there was judgment when you couldn't do it. And so it was like this weird thing that, yeah, when I got to look at Jesus and to see him, was like, whoa, who's this person that cares for the outsider and for the lost and the least, and all these people whose society has kind of pushed away and kept at arm's length? And it's the religious people that have an issue with Jesus, which I thought was so interesting to me. That it just kind of made me think like, wow, if this guy is for people who don't belong, who don't fit in, who don't have it all together, maybe he could be for me too. And yeah, changed everything.
Yeah, one of the things that stands out, and I guess we'll get more into this. Also, I'm stealing that line, Jesus becomes homework. I think this that extends beyond your schooling thing.
Yeah.
Just the interesting sort of parallel of the institutional system of school, and I didn't connect with Jesus in this thing, into this sort of parachurch exist outside of the institution, where you met people that were passionate about who he was and his way of life, not just the things that he said, but the way that he lived, who he embraced. It's like, this is the way that you met him, right? And that's continued to inform the way that you do ministry, the way that you do life, and the way that you continue to introduce people to who he is. Even, I know, again, we're getting into the story of the origin of the Tampa Underground, but it's like that's really what it is, was like, it's a different way. Helping people find Jesus outside of an institutional system where he didn't make sense, where it was not a real picture of who he was, but a sterilized, sanitized version. So I don't know, that's just fascinating to me. So you said you got connected in 2018, where you guys came back, but there was there a connection to the underground before you left to go to the, did I hear that right? What's the story when you got connected?
So I mean, I would have gotten connected to the underground in 2009, 2010. So InterVarsity at the University of Tampa was a microchurch of the underground at the time, and a lot of the leaders in.
Sorry, we lost power here, so that happens sometimes. Everything went dark here. So what I heard was InterVarsity was a microchurch of the Tampa Underground at the time. So pick it up from there, Tomy.
Yeah. So, I mean, reaching students, Bible studies, outreach on campus, trying to disciple students, that would have been my everyday as a college student. And then on top of that, we were kind of in this broader underground ecosystem where, you know, weekly we were getting together and got to see other microchurches. And it was just the craziest thing to me, because I mean, not only did you have college students, and so you had this network of microchurches. So the college students would be there, but then you'd have the guys who are coming out of the addiction, work of Timothy Initiative. And then you had the women who were in the sex industry who were kind of coming out of that through Created. And then you had all these people who are part of different house churches. And you just had this kind of wide, diverse array of people that really it felt like we have no business being in the same room with one another. Because I mean, the University of Tampa is like a private liberal arts college. I mean, the kids drive better cars than their teachers. It's ridiculous. And so it felt like we have no reason to be under the same roof, but that's what Jesus does, right? Like finds these people who really, and makes them a people that were not a people, this fellowship of difference, if we want to quote Scott McKnight on that. And so, yeah, I mean, that would have been my first introduction to the underground, would have been those early college years. And it felt like, you know, even when we moved away and we lived in Cayman for 6 years, it still very much felt like we were part of the underground, still very much considered ourselves underground. It's just when we came back in 2018, that's when we started working for them. And so, yeah, long relationship there.
What was that transition like? How did that come to pass?
Us working for the underground?
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Well, Brian Sanders, being who he is, has a way of making things happen. So we were in Cayman. I was doing stuff with InterVarsity out there for a number of years, and we kind of had felt like, and maybe it's kind of true of the underground story in general, it's, you know, you love the campus, you're seeing meaningful things happen there, and yet there just feels like, okay, there's got to be something else. Like I'm having this experience on a daily basis on campus, but then Sunday mornings still feel like such a big disconnect between my daily life and this moment right here. And, through our own personal discontent and maybe some of the discontent that we had seen from our friends around us, we were thinking about what it would look like to start some sort of networked expression of the church in Cayman. And so the underground had just started its movement school. I think even before that, underground opened 2018. We saw something online for it, and Brian had said, you know, if you were thinking about coming back to Tampa for anything, this would be the thing to come back for. And that was all the confirmation that we needed to go. And so we went, and then that's when we got told about movement school. And movement school was them trying to equip other city leaders to start networks like this and journey with them. And so we said, yeah, sure, let's hop into that. And the very first kind of module of that cohort, you know, my wife, she just has this feeling like, man, I need to talk to Brian. Like I've had meetings with Brian, but she had never had meetings with him before. And so she decides, I want to sit down with him. I want to pick his brain, because she's very much in the business world, but was trying to figure out mission and how those things overlap with each other. And in the middle of the meeting, towards the end, he just kind of asks her, you know, is Cayman home? Do you think he'll be there forever? And would you want to come back and take my job? And work for the underground. And she's, for whatever reason, said, yeah, that sounds interesting. And so we're catching up at the end of the day or whatever, and I'm asking her how her meeting with Brian went, and she goes, well, he asked us to come back to Tampa. And I was like, wow, what happened in that meeting that all of a sudden everything is being uprooted? And so Underground Open was January of 2018. We were back in Tampa December of 2018. So things happen quickly, and that's how we got here. Strange series of events.
All right, we have to go back a little further, because so far I love context and all of the things. So for those that are listening, like we heard a little bit of the story of like there's the Timothy Initiative, and there's Created, and there's InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and there's this MicroChurch, and then we were in the Cayman Islands, and then you got a job. But like there's a whole network story.
There's a lot that we're cutting out there.
Back over here that you can't see my hand anymore, right? So again, we talked about this before we got on. We always say, like, if I'm telling the origin of the Kansas City Underground and Rob tells it, there's going to be similarities and overlap, but it's also just my angle. It's my part of the story. So, I know based on what you're saying, like you weren't there when it, quote unquote, necessarily launched, but it sounds like you were a part of this network from pretty early on. So, like, take us back further to, like, what's the origin of this little network of these micro churches you were mentioning? What's the beginning point? What's the history?
Yeah. Good question. So I guess as best as I can understand it, because I was not there in the very beginning. A lot of the story kind of goes back to 1995, and some of those, Brian Sanders, who's founder and was executive director for a number of years, was on staff with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at the University of South Florida, and was just doing campus ministry and meeting students, and beautiful things were happening on campus. And they were doing real meaningful ministry, experiencing the kingdom on campus. And very early on, Brian would have been intentional about helping these students connect to the broader city. And so they started to develop a heart and a calling, not just for the campus, but for the city of Tampa. They would have done things like urban plunges and urban immersion experiences and tutoring programs and a whole bunch of things, trying to connect with the heart of God, understanding that, he identifies himself and aligns himself with the poor and the least. And so that would have been huge to them. And so, because of the nature of campus ministry, you really have sort of a shelf life with them, right? Like, they're with you as long as they're students, but eventually at some point they do graduate, they do move on. And I think that transition, for anybody who's been a part of a campus ministry or a parachurch ministry, that transition is always a shocker. But I think it was especially so in this particular case, because if you're somebody who's doing, you're running tutoring programs, you're used to discipling students, you're planning outreaches on campus, and you're doing that, you feel a high sense of ownership and empowerment to then go into a traditional prevailing model church and to kind of be treated as a consumer, or everything being about, like, how do we make this Sunday experience more comfortable for people? It just feels like such a disconnect. Like, to say, okay, here I am having a really intense one-on-one discussion with this person, and they're working through all sorts of things, whether that's family issues, relational dynamics, what have you. You're having a conversation with somebody who's homeless, and you're seeing the image of God in this person. And then to come to a Sunday morning experience and to have the kingdom defined as those 2 hours of a day, was just like, well, then what's all this other stuff? And what does this mean? And so there's this disconnect. And, Brian has written about this in Underground Church. So if anybody's read the book, they will know that he talks about this, but just kind of these three factions of people that emerged was, there's a group of people that could not handle the disconnect, and so kind of left the church, but didn't really leave Jesus. They just felt like, I just can't do this anymore. There were some who maybe had acquiesced entirely and kind of just said, okay, well, this just is what it is. Maybe those days of following Jesus radically was a thing of then, but not now. And so they kind of settled in. But then there was this third group of people who stayed, but just felt like, there's got to be something more here that we can do. And so eventually that won out. Brian feeling very responsible for all the students that he would have led and discipled and journeyed with to watch them go through this struggle. And so eventually I think they sit down and they kind of just rattle off 50 names of people that they had journeyed with, and they knew were kind of in this similar boat. And one by one, just kind of sat down with them and said, hey, I feel like something's not right. You feel like something's not right. I have no idea what that means, but should we do that together? Can we go through that process together? Would you want to? And all of them said yes. And so there was no sense that this was going to be a church or what the underground is even going to be. But it was a commitment to journeying with one another, praying with one another. And that's exactly what happened. They would there's 50 of them. They broke up into, I think, 7 different house churches. They would have met and prayed, not necessarily for the underground, but for the bride of Christ in the city of Tampa, that Jesus would be glorified in his church and in his bride. And, eventually that would have evolved into this Revelation Bible study and these long conversations about, what do we see is wrong with the church? And what does it actually mean to be the church? So the deconstructing process of when we say worship, what do we mean by worship? And all of the things that kind of get entangled, not just like the specific methods of how worship is expressed, but when we talk about worship in the church, what do we mean by that? And so that would have been in that period of time. And so, if you're familiar with the underground story, Manila in the Philippines is a huge part of our founding. And that would have been, 2007, where, maybe 9 adults, 10 kids spent 9 months in the Philippines. And the whole point of that was just to kind of get outside of the Western church and the American mindset and just learn from some other people, to sit at their feet and to hear God in a new way. And, that would have been where we got clear on our ecclesiology and our definition of church. That's where we would have hammered out some of that dual operating system that some people are familiar with. There's diagrams. You can find that online. But then also our 18 values that make up our manifesto, that would have been in the Philippines. So 2007, coming out of Manila, that's when we would have officially been the underground. But the story goes back to 95. And so it's a long story. And I'm sure, people felt that as I was trying to explain it just now.
There's always a story behind the story, which is important. We would say the same thing. While we're only 3 years old, there's 10 or 15 years between several of us that are quote unquote leaders or directors of exploring different methods of being the church, different ways of being the church, different ways of being on mission, and all of those things informed it. So it's encouraging to hear, like, it's a long, slow journey. It's not just hey, we started and then boom, we're a network with,
right.
I think 400 something microchurches in the history of the underground in Tampa.
Yeah, it's been something crazy like that. We've said yes to 400 or something like that in the course of our existence.
Yeah.
Can I ask one other question too, Tomy? Like, what was your first experience of a microchurch family? Was it that InterVarsity group? Was there another one that emerged as you moved deeper into Tampa Underground? Kind of unpack your first kind of experience of discovering this other way of being the church.
Yeah, it would have been my time with InterVarsity. And so what's interesting is, trying to think about it now, I don't know when I would have thought about InterVarsity as a microchurch or even just it being the church as much as, I don't know. I wonder, I don't have fully developed thoughts around this, so apologize in advance. But it's one of those things where it's like, even if you didn't necessarily have the language for it, you were experiencing it and you kind of knew that whatever you were experiencing, it's like, this is real and this is meaningful. And there's a way that I felt connected to the people in my chapter. There's a way that I felt a lot of ownership over the campus, like assigned by God to be there, not just as a student, but as a missionary. And yeah, just these high moments of encountering God with our community and with the broad underground family. And so, I mean, I don't know if I would have known it would have been a microchurch or understood it as a church. And part of some of that is, parachurch ministries. You're not really supposed to say you're the church. And there's a whole other conversation that gets baked into that. And so I think our staff workers were always really careful to not try to say that. Like, they knew that they couldn't by InterVarsity's standards or what have you. But anytime we had a conference and a guest speaker came in, I mean, Alan Hirsch came in and just like totally threw a grenade in that and was like, he was like, okay, InterVarsity, this is what you're saying, but let's be real here. Yeah. So it would have been InterVarsity to answer your question.
Well, let me kind of make a turn a little bit. Again, we've heard about the now all the way back to 95 and then to 2007 with this trip to Manila, which really kind of grounded it in its own identity. Not we're InterVarsity, but we're not, and we're the church. But like now it's like we have an identity as the underground. New works are kind of spinning out of that. You have this experience. So just going to this question of, I think I can pull some general principles out, but how do you think the history of that founding affects current day? So, the way that you think now, the way that you see individuals, and the way that you equip and empower people, it's like, how did that origin story affect the current iteration of the underground?
Yeah. I mean, that's such a multifaceted, multi-layered question. Because I guess
I'm just trying to keep up with your level of intellect, Tomy. Because
false.
You're one of the smartest people I know.
You got to meet more people. That is not true. But yeah, I think there's a few different ways to think about it. I mean, one, I think the parachurch, oh gosh, this gets layers. So on one hand, in terms of the actual like structure of the underground, the way that I try to explain it to some people who are maybe coming out of that parachurch world is it can feel like, and I apologize if my community is listening to this and they totally disagree. Feel free to fire me, but it's almost like a parachurch ministry InterVarsity on steroids, right? Like, instead of having just your missional small groups or whatever, you have microchurches, and instead of your leadership team, you have your elder body, and instead of your large group gatherings, you have your Sunday gatherings that are more of the equipping space. And so there's a way that has informed what we kind of our structure, even the way that we approach things like fundraising and money. It's like, so often, a lot of prevailing model churches or traditional churches, you hear every week about your tithes and your offerings and giving, and it can kind of feel like we're twisting your arm to get you to give. But for us, one of the things that we do is we draw up an annual budget and we propose that to the community. And we say, hey, we don't want to have a conversation about money every week. So can we just take these 2 Sundays, maybe 3, to talk through the budget, and you just commit to giving, and we take you at your word. You pledge, we commit to it, and maybe we'll follow up with you a couple times a year to make sure that to let you know where you're at in your pledge. But that comes out of that origin story. But so there's some of that I think is true. But I think some of the broader things about culture and DNA, I think, have also carried over. So that deconstructing process, I think that's still very true of us today. And maybe one of the things that's always getting me in trouble as I talk to some of our more seasoned leaders is, they're always wanting to deconstruct, well, what do you mean when you say that? And why? I think that this is actually the thing that you're trying to hit at. So there's a way that maybe I want to converge on a model or a tool or something. And they're always challenging me to get back to the principle and the overarching methodology or something. And so I think that's true of us. I still think, because the heart behind the origin of the underground is a pursuit of Jesus and a relentless pursuit of Jesus. I
Mm.
still think that's true of us today. Like, you talk to any of us and we'll say, yeah, the underground, if God told us to shut it down tomorrow, we would in a heartbeat, because it's always actually been about him. And we
Mhm.
don't care about the underground, and we don't care even about microchurches or even discipleship necessarily. We care about Jesus. We love Jesus, and Jesus cares about these things too. So then we care about those things.
Mhm.
And so I still think that's true of us today. I mean, we've learned a lot since, but yeah, I think a lot of that heartbeat is still the same. And the bias towards, yes, the wanting to empower, the, stirring the calling question versus trying to get people to volunteer for some program that we've put together. It's like, nah, man, that's who we are. So there's a lot there. Hopefully that answered your question.
No, I actually want to do a follow-up, pursue that line a little bit further, because, we've interviewed Lucas and we've interviewed Stacy for different things. Like, I think with Stacy, I'm trying to remember back, that conversation was kind of around that calling piece, and how everyday people can become microchurch leaders. And I know that is like, that's in the origin story. You're looking at, again, the institution, and you're going, it's only a few people doing it, but like, we have these really normal people out here doing things. So how do we equip more of these people to do these things? So yeah, I'm curious, maybe talk about calling a little bit, like how that has played such an important part of the Tampa Underground in your story. Because I know that is something that you really lean into. We do as well. We use different language around it, but I think without that piece of helping people identify their calling, the story is different.
Yeah. I mean, I think even as we talk about like things that maybe we've learned or repeated principles, I mean, just one of the things that we found in journeying with microchurch leaders over the course of time is that, calling is a thing that makes a difference. Like, anytime that we've asked somebody to take on something that we want, or like we have an idea for, and we say, hey, could you fill in? Sometimes it works out well, but a lot of times it does not. Those people do not persevere because mission is hard. And at some point, everybody wants to quit. You hit some wall, your leadership team implodes. The person that you are investing so much of your time and energy in, and we're really hopeful about, they decide that actually they'd rather practice, I don't know, Wicca or something. And you're just like, what does any of this mean anymore? Like, why did I say yes to this? Because a lot of ministry is heartbreak. But if somebody is called to that thing, there's an element of perseverance and there's an element of endurance that just, you can't talk them out of it. So that's been really interesting, is that, we've seen that in our network, that there comes a point where everybody wants to quit. And they'll say to each other, I want to quit. And everyone's like, yep, me too. I'm right there with you. But Jesus. So what do we do with that? Like, he hasn't told us to stop. So we're going to keep going. We're going to keep doing this thing. And so that's been a really key part of our network, is that, and trying to help people connect to the assignment that God has given them. And so I think there's been a lot of development in how we've understood calling to play out over the course of time, just in the nature of journeying with people. But I think even as a college student, I mean, this is part of how maybe the underground and InterVarsity have been kind of intertwined for me, is that even as a student, I would have been asked the question, who are you called to? And who are the people that you're losing sleep over? And who are the people that you pray for first? And who are the people that your heart just breaks for on campus? And so it would have been contextualized to the place where I was, but it was always, okay, who has God placed on your heart? And if God is giving you that assignment, go do that. And we're going to move out of the way. We're not going to kind of play intermediary or say, yes, that is from God or isn't from God. We're trusting that, the good shepherd speaks to his people and that his sheep know his voice. And so that would have been true then, and it's still true in our network now. Yeah.
I mean, I'm wondering too, as people are discovering calling and they're out on the missionary journey, what are some of the key stages that you all began to discover over time? Like, were there repeated patterns? And then how did you respond? Like, what's sort of the core equipping that you guys want to invest into every potential disciple maker / missionary that might see a new spiritual extended family emerge from that? People that their heart is broken for,
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the missionary journey, because I mean, you guys are familiar with this, but some of the listeners might be familiar with this too, is that, a number of years ago, I guess a group of researchers came and they were kind of asking the question of like, what makes for a persevering microchurch leader or something to that nature. And so they conducted a series of interviews with our people. And really, it was kind of a wide array of our people, not just like, these are the 50 founders, and it was people who had been part of the community for a long time, people who had just found out about the underground and signed up with joined their ministry into our ecosystem, young, old. It was really a diverse community of people. And they started to notice that as they were doing this, there's maybe these key themes that emerged. And so one day they kind of sat down and mapped it out. Jeremy and the whole team, they kind of mapped out this some of those themes and came up with this missionary journey, essentially. And so what they identified was, and of course, you can find the diagrams on our website and all these things. But there's this common thread of, usually there's sort of this altar moment with Jesus being Lord. Like the moment that you realize that he's coming for your whole life. Like he's not just going for 99% or even 99.9%. He's coming for the whole thing and the whole lordship of Jesus over your life. And so that's usually not like a first conversion. It can be, but it's usually it's like some sort of altering of your life and your understanding, like, okay, this status quo faith isn't it anymore. Like I can't have it and hold on to Jesus at the same time. So that there's usually some sort of encounter with pain. So like liminality, that just is this moment where, you're realizing, okay, the Sunday school answers don't sit well anymore. When I look at the suffering of the world or the suffering of my own life, and now I'm having to contend with these two things, like this tension that Jesus is Lord, that he wants all of me and all my life and all the world. And yet there's also pain, deep pain. And how do these two things align with each other and exist alongside each other? What do we do with that? And what we would say is that those two things actually are prime conditions for a person to hear calling. So it's not even necessarily that the calling is directed to the pain, right? So sometimes it is, right? Like you have an experience. I think about someone like John Dangler in our community, for example, who he has this really sort of formational experience with a man in an alley, a poor man in an alley. And to him, it was like, how can my brother who's made in the image of God sleep in an alley, and I go home and sleep in my comfortable bed, and I can forget that person ever even existed? And it haunts him, right? Like it's something that just messes with him. And so that pretty much that led into his calling, where he's done work with the poor and the homeless for, over a decade now, almost two, right? And it's part of his life's calling, or is his life's calling. And so it can be directly connected. It doesn't have to be, but it opens you up to the possibility of hearing God in a whole new way. And of course, you start something, you go through the whole emotional journey of experiencing roadblocks and setbacks, and you're pivoting and you're persevering. And, if all goes well, you mature. What we find is that cycle is what creates a mature disciple of trying, experimenting, failing, and persevering. And so all that to say is that there's this journey that we've noticed that microchurch leaders go on. And what we found as we've shared this with people is that this isn't even necessarily something that is just true of our network, or it's something that we have done, but it's something that God is doing. And so people who are not connected to the underground in any way, shape, or form, maybe even people listening to this, will look at the missionary journey and say, oh yeah, I resonate with that. Like I identify those moments in my life. And so because of that, the question then for us is, well, what do we do? If this is something that God does, what's our responsibility? And so we have done our best to create environments and ecosystems that can kind of accompany people on that discipleship journey. So we want to respect the autonomy and the authority of the microchurch and the leader, right? So part of what we say with that is that as the microchurch leader, if you're called to this group of people, well, then you're the priest in that parish, you're the pastor of that community, you're the shepherd. So you're responsible for the discipleship of that people. You're responsible for the care of those people. We're not going to do it for you. And in some cases, it's actually really inappropriate for us to come in and try to create a discipleship plan for those people. But what we can do is we can create bigger environments, or we can cultivate an environment to the extent that it helps you in the discipleship of your people. You can use those things. So for example, if we understand that, key to a person being a disciple is them being rooted and grounded in the love of God. Well, what we'll do is we'll put on this Jesus Encounter weekend. And for the entire weekend, it's just 48 hours dedicated to people experiencing the tangible love of God in radical ways. But we're not going to recruit your people. You have to recruit your people for that. We're setting the table. You got to actually invite people to show up for dinner. And so we'll do that in a couple of key stages of the journey. And really the part where the network becomes a little bit more direct is as people step out in calling and start doing things. That's where we start directly working with the leader. Because then, our services, facilities, training, media, coaching, all that makes a lot more sense once you've actually started a microchurch. It doesn't make as much sense when you're just kind of a member of a microchurch. And so that's part of what we've seen emerge over time as some of the repeated principles is that, there comes a point in the journey where the needs shift. Right. So in those very early stages of the journey, a person who's, pre-calling and even starting into their calling, what they're looking for is they're looking for permission. They're looking for tools. They're looking for training. They're looking for anything that they can because it's all new. And the fact that they can actually do this and that they're allowed to do it and that there's somebody who's saying, yes, please go do that thing is mind blowing to them. But the needs of that activated leader versus the needs of maybe a persevering leader, somebody who's hit the wall, who's been through a few cycles of pivoting and has wanted to quit a few times, their needs change drastically. And so for them, they're not looking for trainings anymore. The questions are different. At first, it's like, can I do this? Like, how do I start? For other people, for the persevering leader, it's how do I do this for the rest of my life? How do I persevere and endure? And so what they need is relationship and reciprocity. They need missionary peers that are going to remind them of their calling and take them back to, okay, well, yes, you want to quit, but this is what Jesus has said. And so there's a way that we've seen those two things, in our network. And we've tried we're still working through how do you care for both of those kinds of leaders? For a long time, we did a lot of stuff pre-calling and calling. But as our network has gotten older and as our leaders have journeyed, it's how do you help people endure and persevere? And so,
that's good, man.
Sorry, that's a long answer.
No,
I hope you're editing this stuff.
No, I'm not cutting any of that out for sure. It's helpful to get the whole perspective, and to be reminded that yes, we're empowering everyday people. Yes, it's normal people who have normal jobs that have chosen to join Jesus in a specific context. It's also important to remember that, for most of these networks, there is a small centralized team that says, we don't want you to have to do this alone. Like we're going to dedicate time to support you in that, like Paul is not igniting these little works throughout that ancient Greco-Roman world and then just going, hope it all turns out okay. There's follow-up letters. I'm sending Timothy to you. I'm sending this next thing. There is a connection to a bigger family that is part of the sustaining power, and you have to dedicate time to that. So again, I think it's important to hear the whole story. So
Yeah, I mean, with that, I mean, maybe that's part of it too, is that we found that microchurches, the life of a microchurch, life in a microchurch necessitates a network like you're talking about. Like there comes a point where you need more than just this thing. Like the microchurch is a church, totally, absolutely. And yet you do need this broader ecosystem to sustain and to endure. And even just to be able to provide some of the trainings and learnings. So to be able to say to a microchurch leader, one of the things that we've observed is, the average life of a microchurch is 2 to 3 years. And so we've had microchurches that have lasted for 12, 15 years. But what that essentially means is that, every 2 to 3 years, they've had to do some major change or iteration or change that is almost like a different microchurch, but maybe it's the same name, or it looks differently than it did 2 to 3 years ago. And so to help microchurch leaders kind of wrestle with that as they're experiencing some of the difficulties, and they're wondering, okay, when do I pivot? When is it time to change the people group or change the microchurch or whatever? You're helping them, preside not just over the birth of a thing, but also the death of a thing sometimes, and to go through that. And so all that is just the value of having a network that can kind of walk with you in your individual expression of the church.
Well, hey, I know we're coming to kind of the end of this time together. We always like to get a story, though, to make it real. So, I mean, you've told a little bit of your story, which we appreciate. But if you were to think of, man, like what's the one or two stories that I just always love to tell, like the one that's like, man, that really embodies the heart of who we are, to see this normal person doing this small thing that nobody's making a video about necessarily. Nobody's writing a big article on. What's one of the stories that just makes you go, this is why I'm persevering and enduring?
Oh man, that's a good question. There's one that immediately comes to mind. I'm trying to figure out if that's one I want to tell, though, because I feel like there's a few. Oh gosh. I mean, I'll go there. So I mean, I just think about there's a woman in our network named Stacey Hester, and I just think any and every church leader has to contend with someone like a Stacey Hester. Like, to me, so Stacey Hester is a single mom out in this small town called Zephyr Hills, and I mean, the lady, she takes care of raccoons. Like, I don't know why she would ever think this is a good idea. And we've told her it's not a good idea. But like the other day, there was a time we were on a call and I was talking to her and she said, yeah, I rescued this raccoon. This raccoon was, so she already had one. She saw a second one and said, this one needed rescuing. I said, Stacey, it's a raccoon. It doesn't need rescuing. That thing has rabies. Stay far away from it. But, so that's the kind of lady that she is. But it's just motley. Like, anytime you talk to her, she's like, always she cries so easily because she's just got this tender heart. And yet this woman is like a walking revival. Like, she's started COVID maybe with one closet where she had clothes to give away to single women, but people have kind of rallied around her. Now she's got several closets. I mean, this is what trips me out, is that Stacey Hester, this lady who takes care of raccoons and rescues raccoons, when people in this town of Zephyr Hills have an issue, they call the police. When the police have an issue with a mother or like see a woman on the street or whatever, they call Stacey Hester and say, hey, Stacey, can you go deal with that? Like, we recognize you're the person who's best poised to go deal with this lady in the street. And so she's on call. Like, what planet does that happen? And if you were to like meet Stacey Hester and you were to talk to her, first of all, chances are you probably wouldn't. First of all, she probably wouldn't want to be on your team, like your traditional church team, or she's been there and just hasn't really quite fit. And so you're not like, you don't think like, oh yeah, she's like edgy, cool, hip church planter, totally gonna like whatever, be a celebrity sensation or whatever. And yet, I don't know, has spiritual positional authority in the town of Zephyr Hills. And I just think, my gosh, if that's not the work of Jesus.
We did actually connect, Stacy and I. So
okay.
at the MicroChurch conference, she pulled me aside at one point, and I don't know how she knew who I was, but we just connected for 10 minutes or so, just talking about her work with single moms. I think she had listened to one of our podcasts, and
Okay.
we had highlighted single mom KC, and she's like, "You got to connect me with single mom KC. This
So
is what I
good.
do," and I'm trying to connect these two things together. I'm like, I know that for those of us in church leadership for a long time, like we go to conferences and we connect with other people in other cities, and we're trying to figure out what they do and learn from them and then go back and implement them. So it's not like it's anything new, but it was like this little bright spot for me, something I got really excited about, where it was like, what if these new microchurch movements that are happening in these cities, and it's just that, grassroots bottom up stuff of just the normal people, where you're like, this single mom in Zephyr Hills is connecting with this network of single moms in Kansas City, and like, what's the next node? You know what I mean? And the connecting points in between them, and like, what begins to happen when those people, not just your paid professionals, but the normal folk, when they start connecting, and these networks just go, So
Yeah.
that's cool that that's the story that you went to. So,
Yeah.
and they have connected since the MicroChurch conference. So I'm not sure what is brooding, but hopefully something is.
Love that, man.
Yeah, she's wild, but she's awesome. I mean, gosh, it just, the list goes on and on. I mean, I just even think about the clinic, like the free clinic that the underground has is just incredible. Like the way that they are able to provide healthcare for people who cannot afford it, and they're just, I don't know, they pray over samples and testings and all sorts of stuff. Like they've had people intern with the clinic who are not Christians, who through working with the clinic and seeing the way that they go about patient care and praying for patients and patients experiencing healing and all sorts of things, they've become Christians because of their work with the clinic. And that just being one girl who said, I have this idea, and people getting behind her and saying, yeah, let's do it. And all the people that volunteer their professional help and services. And man, it's just, I don't know, these people might not ever be famous, but their stories are so remarkable, and I think they're noteworthy. So,
That's good. Well, Tomy, thanks so much for giving us your time today and sharing the story about the emergence of Tampa, and then just some of the modern stuff too, the stuff happening today, and just so appreciate the connection. And just real quick, where can people find more? Highlight what's the connection? So, I as someone that's been through movement school, I'm assuming that's still happening. I would say sign up.
yeah. So, I mean, they're always changing things around. So, I mean, I think that's also something that is true of us in our origin story, and is true of us now, is that we rarely ever do the same thing for too long. We're always reinventing things. So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Hopefully this was helpful in terms of people getting connected or wanting to learn more about the underground. I mean, gosh, undergroundnetwork.org has all the stuff pertaining things going on with movements. So yeah, we'll have different intensives, online intensives that have done and will be doing going forward. Right now, I think the movements team is also doing stuff around helping people launch microchurches. So they've got some webinars coming up soon on how to start a microchurch. So that's a great place as any to get started. They're always open to people who have questions or wanting to receive coaching or have a conversation about either transitioning their church to a more networked approach or trying to start a network of microchurches. They love those things. So Stacy at undergroundnetwork.org or Jeremy at undergroundnetwork.org, perfect people to connect to. Brian's book, Underground Church, is a great place to find out more about our story and some of the I guess pillars of the underground. He also has a book on microchurches, which is also a great place to start if you're looking at starting a microchurch. I mean, there's a documentary out there, Underground People, which you can find somewhere on the interwebs. The rabbit hole is deep, so have at it.
Amen. Well, Tomy, again, thank you for being a trailblazer.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many of us that are grateful beyond words for the example that you all have been and the embodiment that you've been. That there's another story for what it means to be the church, and that we don't have to be compliant and just silently comply with the current structure. We also don't have to like leave defiantly and give everything a finger.
Right.
We can embody a different way of being the church inside of Christianity in America that's prophetic and ancient, but also fresh. And I know it required everything.
Yeah.
And thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having us and for the inspiration that you guys are, as you guys have been faithful in your own city. And yeah, like I said, there are ways that we are learning from you all. And I think that was always the hope too, was, you know, as much as the underground might have a little bit of history in comparison to some of these other networks, we also trust that we're not doing it the best. We're not the only way to do it, that other people have other things that we can learn from. And so to just watch some of the things that you guys do and say, hey, that's actually a really cool idea. Let's try that. Or what can we observe here? I just think it's been a gift to us. So thank you so much for that. And for being open-handed with your learnings as well.
Oh.
Are you guys going to stop calling us noobs then, or stop soon?
Not yet. Not yet.
I mean, you guys talk to
Sister Noob number one, Sister Noob number two.
You got to talk to the other team about that. I'm just
just a little guy.
I'm just a little guy. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much for hanging in with us today. Next week, we'll be back with an interview with Daniel, Yang, and Mila, who are part of the Prodigal Network. So hope you'll come back, join us for that. And we say grace and peace.